One of the strangest realities in modern American politics is that voters increasingly describe the country as failing while simultaneously refusing to politically punish the system producing those failures. A new CNN poll shows roughly 73% of Americans are worried about the economy. Now, historically, numbers like that would be devastating for the incumbent. In older political environments, prolonged economic dissatisfaction usually translated into political backlash because voters connected outcomes to accountability. But modern American politics no longer functions that way consistently. Despite inflation, affordability concerns, debt pressure, declining institutional trust, and widespread economic anxiety, the electorate remains almost perfectly locked into hardened tribal alignment. Even when voters believe the country is headed in the wrong direction, many still refuse to detach from partisan identity. That contradiction reveals something much deeper than polarization. It reveals a collapse in civic reasoning. Politics in America is increasingly becoming identity first instead of outcome first. Voters are behaving less like citizens evaluating systems and more like tribes defending psychological territory. And once that happens, democratic accountability begins to break down because emotional allegiance becomes stronger than institutional performance. And that is not a political problem. That is a civic crisis. This is the Partisan Games Podcast. So this new CNN poll itself is not actually the most important part of the conversation. Polls move constantly, numbers fluctuate, political momentum changes week to week. What matters is the contradiction hiding inside the data, because the contradiction tells us something important about the condition of the American electorate. If 73% of Americans are actually worried about the economy, that should normally create a major political consequence for the party in power. Historically, sustained economic anxiety almost always translates into significant electoral punishment. Americans used to evaluate political leadership, at least partially, through material outcomes. If inflation rose, wages stagnated, affordability collapsed, or financial confidence deteriorated, incumbents, they paid the price. That relationship was one of the core mechanisms of democratic accountability. But now we're watching something different happen. Americans increasingly describe the country as unstable, expensive, divided, unaffordable, and dysfunctional while remaining politically frozen in their place. The public appears emotionally dissatisfied while simultaneously remaining psychologically trapped inside hardened partisan identities. That is not normal political behavior historically. And honestly, it explains a tremendous amount of why modern American politics feels so broken all the time. The biggest shift in American politics over the last 20 years is that politics stopped functioning primarily as a system of evaluating governance and started functioning as a system of expressing identity. That distinction matters enormously. Older political coalitions were often transactional. People supported parties because they actually believed those parties would materially improve conditions in some way. There was always emotions involved, obviously. But the expectation of performance still mattered. Political loyalty was more conditional. Modern political identity, however, is increasingly unconditional. For many Americans, political affiliation has become fused with personal identity itself. It shapes media consumption, social relationships, cultural worldviews, moral framing, even psychological belonging. Politics is no longer simply about taxes, budgets, foreign policy, or regulation. It has become cultural and existential. And some politics becomes identity-based. Accountability becomes distorted. People stop asking what caused the problem and start asking which tribe threatened my identity less. That is a completely different framework from democratic decision-making. And it creates a political environment where outcomes matter less than emotional alignment. And the media ecosystem in this country makes this dramatically worse because modern political media is designed less to inform citizens and more to emotionally condition audiences. Fear drives engagement. Anger drives engagement. Outrage drives engagement. Nuance does not. Institutional complexity does not. Constitutional literacy does not. Most political media today is essentially psychological reinforcement. Audiences choose ecosystems that validate emotional priorities and protect tribal identity. Once that cycle starts, political information stops being processed neutrally. Facts become filtered through emotional allegiances first. And that is why two Americans can look at the same exact economic conditions and arrive at completely different political conclusions while believing they are being rational. Because modern political perception is increasingly emotional before it's analytical. And when emotional identity overrides institutional reasoning, voters become easier to manipulate, easier to polarize, and harder to persuade through evidence alone. And that is one of the most dangerous developments in modern democratic life. And of course, the deeper issue underneath it all is civic illiteracy. Most Americans were not taught how institutions actually function in a meaningful depth. Large portions of the public cannot clearly explain how Congress operates, how budgets work, how monetary policy works, how debt finance works, how federalism works, or how constitutional authority is divided between the branches of government. Yet, these same citizens are expected to evaluate one of the largest and most powerful governing systems on earth. That creates enormous vulnerability. When civic understanding weakens, emotional manipulation becomes easier because people lack the institutional framework necessary to connect outcomes to actual policy causes. Instead of evaluating systems structurally, voters respond emotionally to narratives, personalities, branding, slogans, and tribal conflict. And once that happens, elections stop functioning as effective corrective mechanisms. This is why Americans can simultaneously feel overwhelmed by economic pressure while remaining politically immobilized. Many voters no longer process politics through institutional accountability. They process it through emotional identity maintenance. And that is not sustainable in the long term, because democracies only function when citizens can consistently connect governing performance to governing consequences. And one of the defining features of modern America is that people are politically overstimulated but civically undereducated. Americans consume enormous amounts of political content every single day. News alerts, podcasts, social media clips, outrage cycles, viral narratives, partisan commentary, algorithmic conflict. Politics has become psychologically immersive, but civic understanding has not kept pace with political consumption. In many ways, the public is becoming more emotionally political while becoming less institutionally literate at the same exact time. And that combination is combustible, because anger without civic understanding does not usually produce accountability. It produces volatility. It produces tribal escalation. It produces emotional reactions without structural reform. And eventually, systems stop correcting themselves properly because voters lose the ability to distinguish between emotional satisfaction and effective governance. And that may be where America is heading right now. Not towards ideological disagreement alone, but towards a population increasingly incapable of coherently evaluating institutional performance outside of their tribal identity. And if that trend continues, democratic accountability itself becomes weaker over time. So the real danger we face as Americans is not disagreement. Healthy democracies are supposed to contain disagreement. The danger is civic deterioration. A constitutional republic depends on citizens being capable of connecting outcomes to institutions, policies, incentives, and leadership decisions. Once politics becomes purely emotional and identity-driven, accountability begins to collapse because tribal loyalty becomes stronger than performance evaluation. And when voters stop consistently punishing failure, political systems stop fearing failure. That is the deeper warning hidden inside polling like this. Not simply that Americans are frustrated, but that Americans no longer appear capable of translating frustration into coherent civic accountability. And that is a far bigger problem than any political party alone. This is the Partisan Games Podcast.